Morning. It's good to see everybody here today. It's good to be back. I don't think I want to be in a car for another month or so. I'm quite sick of driving now. I'd like for us to take a look this morning at Colossians chapter 1. So go ahead and turn there. Colossians chapter 1. If you go down well, I haven't figured out the schedule quite yet, but if you go down quite often during the middle of the week, down to the square, you'll notice there is usually a couple people standing there waiting for you to come talk to them and ask them questions, or maybe they will stop you as you walk around and ask you questions. And there are other such groups of people who exist, who would argue and present to us that Jesus Christ is the greatest man who ever lived. But that is precisely all he is. That he is simply a great man, that he was the greatest of the prophets, but that's it. And to claim anything further, they would say, would be blasphemous. What I want for us to look at this morning from Colossians is, what is it that makes Christ so great? And within this, we're going to see some things that are not necessarily indicative of his deity. But when they all come together, that is where they point, and that is how Paul concludes in this passage. So I want for us to take a look at this and to see in this beautiful hymn that Paul includes for us what it is he describes makes Christ stand out, what it is that makes Christ so great. It starts in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, and ends in verse 20. We're going to go ahead and read a few verses above and a few verses below for our purposes. Starting in verse 12, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. I want you to notice there this mention of inheritance. We're going to come back to that later. The inheritance of the saints in light, who, speaking still of the Father, who rescued us from the authority of darkness. I want you to notice that as well, that authority of darkness. Who rescued us from the authority of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Paul's going to come back to that as well. Then he begins this hymn. And you may have a Bible that formats it this way and kind of sets it off, and you can kind of tell that it's written in poetry. We don't have any music for how it might have sounded in the first century. I wish there was. I would love for someone to come along and take this and set it to music for us to sing. But verses 15 through 20 then, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or rulers or dominions or authorities. All things have been created through him, for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross, through him, whether things on earth or things in heaven. That ends the song. He continues and says, and although you, speaking to the Colossian Christians, were formerly alienated, separated, we talked about this during Bible class, although you were formerly alienated and enemies in mind and in evil deeds, but now he reconciled you in the body of his flesh through death, in order to present you before him, now the hymn refers to the Father, present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach if indeed you continue in the faith, firmly grounded and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. That's the entirety of the text I want for us to look at. Those first few verses, we're not going to dive into those as much, but it kind of sets the tone for the things that Paul emphasizes through this song. And once again, I will reiterate, I keep calling it a song because that's how it seems to have been originally written, but we don't know what it looked like or what it sounded like when sung. So maybe Craig will write that for us. I want for us to notice several different points as we move along. The first one, we're going to go step by step through this. The first, who is, verse 15, who is the image of the invisible God. And it sounds, to our ears, like Paul might be jumping straight into the idea that Jesus is divine. I mean, if he's the image of the invisible God, that certainly sounds related. And he's going to make that connection. But when I think of the image of God, my brain immediately goes, I'm sure you're shocked by this, it immediately goes to creation. That is how man was created. Man is created as an image of God. So by describing Jesus Christ as the image of the invisible God, Paul is not simply saying that Jesus was a human, but that he exemplifies what humanity was supposed to be. That he was not just a human, but that he was the human. In 1 Corinthians in Romans chapter 5 as well, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul builds this out in a lot more detail than we have time to explore this morning. But I want you to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45. Here, Paul brings this out in a little more explicit language. He says, verse 45, so also it is written, and he alludes back to Genesis chapter 2, so also is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam, he's not talking about Genesis 2 anymore. The last Adam, he's talking about Jesus Christ. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Through Adam, death was brought on humanity, but through Christ, life is brought upon humanity. So this idea exists, beyond just the image of the invisible God. But we see that language repeated in passages like Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, which describes Jesus in a very similar way. In John chapter 1 and verse 18, he says that the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. We can't see God, no matter how hard we look, no matter how much science progresses. We're never going to get to the point where we can see with our eyes, or we can see on a molecular level who God is or what God looks like. We're never going to get there. And the only way that we can see with our eyes God in any way is through seeing Jesus. And even then, we ourselves are not witnesses to the physical body of Jesus, to his person while he was on the earth. And we experience Jesus through the words of Scripture and through our life as Christians, which he's going to continue to get into. What makes Christ so great? Christ was the fulfillment of Adam. He was the greatest human who ever existed. Number 2, he describes him as the firstborn of all creation. This probably also should remind you of Adam. If you ask, who is the firstborn among humans, not born as in from a mother, but who is the firstborn of all creation, of all humans? Well, that's Adam. Jesus is the firstborn, not of the creation of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, but the firstborn of God's new creation. That through Christ, God begins to make all things new. He begins to take what has been corrupted by sin and wickedness and death and to restore it, which Paul's going to get into some more. And Jesus is the one with whom that begins. That process begins with Jesus. That in his resurrection, he's going to speak in a few verses of Jesus being the firstborn from the dead. That Jesus is himself the firstborn of this new creation. That although he experienced death as does every other man, that he is restored to life, never to die again. And it needs to be accomplished. It's the firstborn of all creation. Number 3, from verse 16. Jesus is the source of all things. He describes this at three levels. For in him all things were created, both, contrast 1, both in the heavens and on earth. Contrast 2, things visible and invisible. And 3, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. All things. You might come along and say, well, I mean, if Jesus is just a human, how is he creating anything? That should be the first thought that enters into your mind. But you might then progress and say, well, maybe Jesus is just a really special angel. And this is an idea that floats around. The Mormons teach a similar thing to that Jesus was basically an angel. And Jesus is not, you see, creating just a few things. He's not limited to creating things on earth. He is also creating things which exist in the heavens. Well, we look up at night and we see all the stars. If we're fortunate, we can see some of the planets spinning around the solar system. We see the stars from unfathomably millions of miles away. We see the glories of the physical creation, the things on earth that surround us, the natural beauty that we have here, and the beauty that exists in the heavens. And that Jesus himself is the creator of those things. But not just those things that we see. Well, we can see all of that, but there are things which are invisible. There are physical things that are invisible. Scientists are always discovering smaller and smaller and smaller little particles. And some of them, they say we can know that those particles exist, but we definitely can't see them. They're just too small. They've got some very advanced microscopes now that can, I think very recently I saw a photograph of, I don't know how they do this sort of thing, but I saw a photograph of atoms. They're getting to the point where they can do that. They're not very clear, they're very fuzzy, and they just look like blurry little circles. But they're able to photograph atoms now. Okay, but we know that atoms are made of even smaller things. They're made of protons and neutrons and electrons. And we know that those are made of even smaller particles as well. We're never going to be able to see those things. We cannot see into the depths of the earth. We can dig down very far, and we have in search for valuable materials, minerals, oil. But if you've ever looked at how far we're actually able to dig down, we can dig pretty far. But it's only a few miles. You know how big the earth is? There are things in the center of the earth that we are never, ever going to see. You might know they exist. You might be able to scan and theorize and examine other celestial bodies and know that those things exist, but we're never going to be able to see them. Beyond the expanses of of our vision and into the skies, into the heavens, there are things that we are never going to see. There are things that are not even material. What about the angels? What about the spirits that exist within us? We can dig deep into the mind. We have been able to dissect humans down to very small parts and come to an understanding of how human physiology and biology works. And yet, we have not yet once, there's no one who has ever seen a human soul. We can't see it. And yet Jesus is responsible for creating all of those things that we can barely even understand or fathom, and we will never see. And yet Jesus is responsible for having created all of it. The things at which we wonder that capture our eye, and the things that we wonder at and can never understand. Thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, these all have the same sort of meaning, don't they? It's power. You noticed a few verses ago, it made mention that the Father rescued us from the authority of darkness. In Romans chapter 6, Paul describes our relationship to sin as slavery. That sin had a kind of power or dominion over us that we could not remove, no matter what we ever did. Hebrews chapter 2 says that fear of death keeps men in slavery. And there's, again, nothing we can do about that. But all of those things that keep us terrified, all of the things that hold power over us, all of the things which we have no way to get out of under their control, Jesus has control over those things. That is not to say that he created sin, but he has an authority for him to create them, he must be before them. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, I have no idea what that means exactly. I don't know how that works. I don't. Not to dive too much into physics, but physicists have no idea how everything holds together either. You know, they have reduced it down to forces such as gravitation and electromagnetism, and they don't know what causes those things either. And so that's where you end up with those smaller and smaller particles, because something has to eventually cause everything else. And I'm sure that at some point they're going, actually, I read an article very recently that they have further subdivided those tiniest of particles into smaller ones. They're always going to do that. Why? Because at some point you have to get an answer. At some point, something has to actually cause something else to happen. And if you keep asking why, yeah, you can keep cutting the pieces into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. We've already gone past what we can see. But maybe, just maybe, what's holding everything together is the will of God. And And someone is probably going to say, well, that sounds like an answer of fantasy from someone who doesn't have an answer. Well, you're right, I don't have an answer. Except that I don't think it's a fantasy. I don't think it's ridiculous at all to believe that at some point there is an answer. And God is that answer. At some point, your effect has to have a cause. And you're going to keep digging and digging and digging until something has to not have a cause. And that would make that thing God. So who is the sustainer of all things? Well, logically, we would have to call that thing God. Paul hasn't done that yet, but that's a very logical conclusion from what he's saying here. That Jesus is before all things. Well, that means he has to exist before the entire universe. We would have to call that thing God. He has to hold everything together. He has to be the ultimate cause. Well, that would make him God. Okay. Because he is before all things, and because in him all things hold together, he has been given authority. This is our next point, number 5. He has been given authority to direct his own body. He is the head of the body of the church. Now, we're so used to calling the church the body that we may forget what that means. The body means that we are individual members. We say member, again forgetting what the word member means. Member refers to body parts. That's what member means. When Paul speaks in 1 Corinthians 13 and 14 about we are all members, he's using that word to mean body parts. We are all body parts of the body. And therefore, no body part, no member, is of any greater value or lesser value than any other member or body part. It's a matter of role. But also, us being Christ's body means that he just naturally has authority over us. It's a natural consequence of that relationship. If a person's head, if their mind is sending signals to their body parts to operate in a particular way, and those body parts are not operating in that way, that's a sign that there is some kind of neurological condition. There's some deficient. Something isn't working right. There's a sickness that exists. If we see that in the church, if the head is giving direction to its members, to the body parts, and the members are not moving as they are directed, there is a spiritual sickness within the church. It's a natural consequence of Jesus' relationship to the church that we are to submit to him. He is great because he is the head of the body. Okay, he continues. What is it that makes him worthy of being the head of the body? Number 7, number 6, that he has overcome death. Number 6. Who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead? Now, I believe that here, when he says beginning, he does not mean the same thing as the first line of verse 17, where he says he is before all things. It is true, John chapter 1, verse 1, that in the beginning, the Word was. In the beginning, Jesus, well, not as the human being Jesus, he hasn't become a human yet, but the Word existed from eternity, from the beginning. That is a true statement, but I don't believe that's exactly what Paul is referring to in verse 18 when he says, who is the beginning? It's immediately followed by this statement, the firstborn from the dead. Well, just as in verse 15, the image of the invisible God and the firstborn of all creation have a kind of connection to one another. Here in verse 18, being the beginning and being the firstborn from the dead, have a kind of connection with one another. That Jesus is the beginning, he is the firstborn from the dead. He is not the only born from the dead. He is the firstborn. Now, the firstborn we would recognize has this right to the inheritance. But he is not the only one who receives inheritance. The firstborn receives a special level. Well, I don't know that this happens all that much in modern society, but in ancient society, this was a really big deal. That if you were the firstborn, I wish we'd bring this back because I'm the firstborn. That'd be very exciting for me. You know, you receive a double portion. So, then you take the number of children, add one. That's, each of those is one portion. And the firstborn gets two of those portions instead of just one. That's how that would work. Well, how does that work with the resurrection? I don't know that it happens in quite that same way, except in terms of authority. But you look at Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. Hebrews 2:10. It was fitting for him, notice the similarity of language. It was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies, that's Jesus, and those who are being sanctified, that's the church, are all of one, as in one Father, are all of one, for which reason he's not ashamed to call them brothers. We have a brother relationship with Jesus. We don't use that language all the time because Jesus is elevated above us, but he is our brother. And yet, because he is the firstborn, it's not that it makes us equals in any sense. He is still elevated. He still receives the greater inheritance of authority. And yet, by becoming like us, by being made, although he was God, by being made also in the image of God, being made as a human, he is able to provide for us the same inheritance which he himself receives. Well, that sounds a lot like what Paul already said in verse 12, Colossians 1:12, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Before we were not qualified to share. Why weren't we qualified? Who is not qualified to receive the inheritance? Anyone who isn't children. By adopting us, by making us to be his children, by Jesus bringing us in as his brothers and his sisters, he has allowed us to share in that inheritance which he receives. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, the greatest of those gifts, the greatest aspect of the inheritance is the resurrection. The resurrection is victory over death. The power of sin is death, and that power is taken away through the resurrection. Jesus receives the resurrection in his body, and we see that in Scripture. We are promised a bodily resurrection, which we have not yet received, but which we are promised. And there's an inextricable connection between those two events, the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection which we are to receive in our bodies. So that, verse 18, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. He was born as a poor child to a poor family. They were working class. He didn't do anything remarkable for most of his young adult life. We see that brief instance in the temple where he interacts with the religious leaders there. But the great miracles and signs which we see him do, he does not work those from his youth. His first miracle which he does, which we read in John chapter 2, is the transformation of the water into wine at the wedding. He doesn't work that miracle until he's about 30 years old. A little older than 30, somewhere around there. And yet, he comes to have the first place, the preeminence, the supremacy in all things. And that's what this passage is about. That's really what the whole book of Colossians is about, is the greatness, the superlative greatness and supremacy of Jesus Christ. For in him, now he makes it explicit, for in him, number 8, Jesus' divine nature. For in him all the fullness, and then your Bible may, in parentheses or in italics, have of God. It's doing that because that's made more explicit later in the book. For in him all the fullness was pleased to dwell. Jesus wasn't a little bit God. He wasn't a lot like God. He wasn't God sometimes. He didn't become God. All of these are things that people teach. There are churches and individuals who teach all of those things, not at the same time, but there are people who teach all of those different things. And none of them are true. They're not even a little true. There's not a hint of truth to it. There's not a little bit of truth, any more than there was a little bit of God in Jesus. In him, all the fullness was pleased to dwell. The fullness of Christ's deity. And in case you're wondering if fullness does there refer to his deity, you can look at chapter 2, verse 9. For in him all the fullness of deity dwells bodily. That Jesus Christ is divine. That he is himself God. As he says in John chapter 10, I'm trying to remember the verse off the top of my head. John chapter 10, verse 30. He makes it pretty explicit there. I and the Father are one. There is a unity that exists between Jesus Christ and his Father that we can never fully comprehend or understand. And yet, we know and we believe it to be true. That Jesus Christ is the greatest human who ever lived. That he is the epitome of what mankind was ever supposed to be. He is the fulfillment of Adam's calling. He is the fulfillment of Adam's existence. And simultaneously, he is the divine. He is the creator. He is the sustainer of all things. He has the preeminence and the supreme authority. And therefore, we go back up. The Father rescued us from the authority of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of the Son of his love. If there's anyone whose authority I want to be under, it's Jesus' authority. It's the authority of Christ. For which cause, Paul says in Romans 6, where he brings out the slavery of sin, that although we were the slaves of sin, we have been redeemed from that. We are no longer under that bondage. And so the logical conclusion is to make yourself a slave again. That's not how we would think. But Paul says that's the only logical conclusion. The only logical conclusion is to find the one who freed you and serve him. Because you know he's going to treat you right. You know he's going to take care of you. And there's no one else you would rather serve. Verse 20. And through him to reconcile all things to himself. Now, there's a lot of pronouns, and it's very easy to get lost among them. He says, and through him, that's through Jesus, to reconcile. The one doing the reconciling here is the Father. And the Father, through him, to reconcile all things to himself. Well, that himself is the Father again, not Jesus. Jesus is the one through whom this all occurs. That the Father reconciles us to himself through Jesus Christ. And yet, at the same time, as I mentioned, there is a unity between the Father and the Son that is really inexplicable. Through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Obviously, that one is speaking of Jesus. There we see the blood, verse 22. But now he reconciled you. Look at what Paul does with this. This is what Jesus was doing in a grand scale of things. Look at how universal some of these terms are. Back when he spoke of the creation, he said both things in the heavens and things on earth, both visible and invisible, whether thrones or rulers or dominions or authorities. And then in verse 20, whether things, the reconciliation, whether things on earth or things in heaven. That's all very general. But specifically, Jesus reconciled you. Jesus took you and reconciled you to the Father through his own blood, which poured forth from his own body. This sacrifice which he makes is deeply personal, and it cost him greatly in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach. He doesn't say this outright. But by telling us that Jesus died so that we can be holy and blameless and upright. If Jesus died for that purpose, and we don't fulfill that purpose, we're making Jesus die in vain. We are killing Jesus in vain. And we become his murderers. Jesus is the greatest man who ever lived. He didn't deserve to die at all. In fact, he's the creator of the entire universe. And he chose to end his own life, not in a suicide sense, but to sacrifice his life, to place himself on an altar and die shamefully, so that you can be holy and blameless and beyond reproach. Are you? And why is the answer no? If indeed you continue in the faith, firmly grounded and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel, the inheritance which Jesus has provided a qualification for us to receive, which you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. Reminding the Colossians that for him this is very serious, because his job is to make sure that they understand how serious this is. I'm not Paul, but I've been tasked with the same purpose. And it is my job to make sure that you understand how serious this is. I mean, this isn't just, okay, this is a big deal. Big doesn't begin to describe it. This is, if I can use the word, this is cosmic in its scale. I mean, I want you to think, when you look outside and you see how vast the universe is, and then think, there's someone who is bigger and greater than all of that, who died for me. And I don't even think about it or care. Do you realize you can't even put it how big of a deal that is. You realize how there is no greater crime than that. And yet it is one of which we are constantly guilty. And Paul says these things not to shame us, but to remind us that this needs to be paramount. It needs to take the first place in our thoughts. If Christ comes, verse 18, to have the first place in everything, should he not have the first place in my life? That's something among the everything. And what do I need to change for that to be true? What am I putting in front of Jesus Christ? What do I love so much I would never give it up for him? What's holding me back? Why can't I let go? Why can't I change? That probably has some connection to what Paul says in verse 24. When he says, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and I fill up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions in my flesh." What does Paul mean when he says, "I fill up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions"? Maybe Paul is saying that in order for me to make good on Christ's sufferings, I owe it to him to suffer a little myself. And I don't think I suffer enough. Not suffer in, beating yourself or cutting yourself or some kind of physical self-inflicted pain. But the kind that Jesus experienced, which was never self-inflicted, but that came on him as a result of his service to God. Am I serving Christ so much and to such a hyperbolic extent that my service leads to my suffering? Do I serve God so much that I lose sleep? Do I serve God so much that my funds are running low? Do I serve God so much that I don't have time for fun activities? Do I serve God so much that I have to actually give something up for once? Or do I go to church and pretend that that's a meaningful thing by itself? These are hard questions. And they probably, reflecting on them, probably doesn't make us very cheerful. And yet, as Paul says, he rejoices in his sufferings. It's not that he's cheerful in the sense of but think how much meaning a life like that has. To know that you're living for something and not just existing for another day. How much greater is that? Do you have any need?